The night Marcus Johnson walked into Harrington's, he told himself it was just dinner. Just one evening, one chance, one reason to believe that 38 years of being a decent man still meant something in a world that rarely slowed down long enough to notice. He had ironed his shirt twice. He had arrived 7 minutes early. He had chosen a table near the window, where the candlelight was warm and the city beyond the glass shimmered with quiet possibility. He was not a man who asked the world for much, only for honesty, for effort, and for the simple dignity of being seen. But as he sat there, straightening his silverware for the third time, adjusting the small arrangement of his hopes into something presentable, Marcus had no way of knowing that the next 2 hours would become the most humiliating of his adult life. And that sitting 4 tables away, a woman worth $3 billion was already watching him with the kind of attention that changes everything. Marcus had built his landscaping and property maintenance company over 11 years, starting with a single second-hand truck and a handshake agreement with his first client, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Abrams, who paid him $40 to rake her backyard leaves. He had grown that $40 handshake into a business with 16 full-time employees, 3 commercial contracts with mid-size real estate firms, and a reputation in his Atlanta neighborhood that he quietly prided himself on more than any dollar figure. He was not wealthy in the way that the magazines meant when they used that word. He was comfortable. He was purposeful. He paid his taxes, coached his nephew's weekend basketball league, and made his mother's Sunday dinner without fail every first week of the month. His friends described him as solid. His employees described him as fair. The women who had passed through his life over the years, and there had been a few who mattered, tended to describe him as wonderful, followed almost inevitably by the word but. Marcus was wonderful, but too busy. Marcus was wonderful, but too serious. Marcus was wonderful, but she was looking for something different, something more exciting, something she couldn't quite name, but was absolutely certain she hadn't found in him. He had learned to carry those buts quietly, tucked away in the place where self-doubt lives in men who refuse to let it show. It was his friend Darnell who had pushed him toward the dating application, a sleek platform that promised compatibility through algorithm and the vague comfort of knowing that someone else had already vetted the worst of human behavior before it could reach your inbox. Marcus had resisted for months. He was not the kind of man who enjoyed curating himself into a profile, distilling 11 years of work and 38 years of living into a handful of photographs and a paragraph that was supposed to communicate everything important while sounding effortlessly appealing. But Darnell was persistent, and Marcus was tired. Tired in the particular way that comes, not from overwork, but from the slow accumulation of evenings spent alone in a house that had more than enough room for more than one person. He created the profile on a Tuesday night and uploaded 3 photographs, all of which Darnell immediately declared too serious, and not one of which featured the smile that Darnell insisted was Marcus's greatest asset. Marcus kept the photographs anyway. Vanessa had messaged him first. Her profile suggested a woman of taste and ambition, mid-30s, corporate attorney, someone who enjoyed rooftop bars and international travel, and described herself as selective, in a way that read less as warning and more as promise. Their messages had been warm and increasingly easy, building over 2 weeks into something that felt like genuine chemistry, the kind that makes a person stay up later than they intended because the conversation refuses to end at a reasonable hour. Marcus had not felt that particular pull in some time, and he let himself want it. He had booked the table at Harrington's because it was the kind of place that said he took the evening seriously without crossing the line into trying too hard a distinction that mattered to him in ways he found difficult to explain and did not attempt to. Vanessa arrived 12 minutes late and made no mention of it. She was striking in person, more so than her photographs had suggested, and Marcus felt the familiar warmth of first impression optimism that he had learned over the years not to trust too quickly. Dinner began well. The conversation moved easily through the early, surface-safe territory of career and travel and city life, and Marcus allowed himself to relax into it, to think that perhaps this was the beginning of something real. He spoke about his business with the measured pride of a man who has built something genuine and knows it. He spoke about his nephew. He made her laugh twice in the first hour, and both times the laugh was real. And then, somewhere in the easy drift between appetizers and the main course, the conversation turned toward money, toward the kind of money that Vanessa, it became clear, had expected to find at the table with her. She asked about investment portfolios, with the casualness of someone who assumed the answer would be impressive. She made a passing reference to a colleague who had recently sold a tech startup and bought a second home in the Hamptons, and she watched Marcus's face as she said it with the careful attention of someone reading a balance sheet. The shift in her expression was not dramatic. It was the subtle withdrawal of interest, the slight flattening of warmth that happens when a person recalculates and finds the numbers insufficient. She did not argue. She did not make a scene. She simply became somewhere else, inside herself, already moving toward the door, while her body was still seated across from him. She excused herself after the entrees arrived, and she did not come back. Her portion of the meal sat untouched on the white porcelain plate. Marcus sat with it for a long, still moment, his jaw tight, his hands quiet in his lap, absorbing the specific quality of humiliation that comes, not from cruelty but from casual indifference. The discovery that someone has weighed you and found you not quite enough, not worth the rest of the evening, not worth even a polite conclusion. He thought about leaving immediately. He thought about calling Darnell. He thought about all the small, particular reasons he had told himself to try again, to stay open, to believe that effort was rewarded in the end. He did none of these things. He stayed. He ordered the dessert he hadn't planned on ordering, and he sat with his quiet dignity at a table set for two, alone in a restaurant full of people who were, for the most part, kind enough not to notice. He did not know that the woman at the corner table had noticed everything. Evelyn Carter had come to Harrington's alone, which was unusual for her. Most of her evenings in Atlanta were structured things, board dinners, charity galas, arranged appearances at functions where her presence carried value beyond her appetite. But this particular Tuesday, she had declined everything and come for the salmon and the quiet, a rare hour of anonymity that her security team permitted only in a short list of approved establishments where the staff understood discretion as a professional obligation. She had watched Vanessa arrive. She had watched the evening begin with the ordinary pleasant awkwardness of two strangers locating their common ground. She had watched the pivot the moment the other woman's posture changed, the almost invisible repositioning of investment. And she had watched Marcus absorb it. She had watched him remain composed. She had watched him order dessert. And something about that, about the quiet, self-contained dignity of a man, sitting alone with his wine glass and his untouched dessert in the aftermath of a small public humiliation, had moved her in a way she could not immediately name. Evelyn Carter was 41 years old and worth more money than most people would encounter in a dozen lifetimes. She had been on the cover of Fortune magazine twice and Forbes once. She had built her first company at 24 from a shared office space in Baltimore with two friends and a product that most people told her would never scale. It had scaled. The company that followed it had scaled further. The third had become the kind of acquisition story that business school professors used as curriculum. She was, by most measurable standards, one of the most successful people in the country, and she had learned over many years that success of that particular magnitude creates around a person a kind of invisible wall through which very few genuine things pass. She had been approached by men who wanted proximity to her name, to her network, to the life that appeared in photographs. She had been courted by men who mistook her ambition for availability and her wealth for loneliness. She had been engaged once to a man named Richard, who had been thoughtful and attentive and genuinely charming right up until the moment she discovered that he had been more interested in her acquisition strategy than in her, and that several of their most intimate conversations had found their way into business proposals submitted by his silent partners. That particular wound had been the deepest of her adult life, not because she had not survived it, but because surviving it had cost her something she was not certain she could recover, the easy willingness to believe that the person in front of her was exactly who they appeared to be. She rose from her table before she had entirely decided to. She crossed the dining room with the unhurried certainty of a woman accustomed to moving through spaces as though they belonged to her, not from arrogance, but from long habit, the settled walk of someone who had stopped waiting for permission. She reached Marcus's table as he was unfolding his bill from the small leather case, and she said, before he could look up fully, "I know this is not normal, but I wanted to tell you that you handled that with a great deal of class." Marcus looked up. He went very still in the way that people go still when something unexpected arrives and the brain needs a moment to catch up with the eyes. He recognized her immediately. Almost everyone in America would have recognized her, and this was not a coincidence that his nervous system processed without some difficulty. He said something that sounded approximately like a complete sentence. Evelyn smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that involved her whole face rather than just the socially appropriate portion. She asked if the seat across from him was available. He told her it was. What followed was 2.5 hours that Marcus would spend considerable time afterward attempting to explain to himself and failing. Evelyn Carter sat down at his table in Harrington's on a Tuesday night and talked to him. Genuinely talked. The way people talk when they have temporarily suspended the performance of themselves and arrived, unguarded, at something honest. She was funny in a dry, precise way. She was interested in his business, in the specific, knowledgeable way of someone who has built things and understands what the building costs. She asked questions and waited for the actual answers rather than the social summaries. She told him about her first company in a way that emphasized the fear and the doubt alongside the outcome, which was not the version of that story she gave to journalists or boards or the carefully curated audiences of the business conferences that requested her presence several times each year. Sitting across from Marcus Johnson at a table that still held the geometry of a failed date, Evelyn found herself saying true things almost without intending to. She told him that money had given her freedom and taken from her, in roughly equal measure, the ability to trust what she was given. She told him she had sat across the room and watched him refuse to be diminished, and that it had reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. That character was its own kind of wealth, and that she had spent a long time in rooms where that particular currency was in short supply. Marcus listened. He responded. He did not flatter her. He did not ask about her portfolio or her board positions or the penthouse apartment that had appeared in an architectural magazine the previous spring. He asked how she had felt the first morning she had walked into an office that truly belonged to her, and what that feeling had been like, and whether it had been everything she had imagined. He asked because he genuinely wanted to know. Evelyn answered honestly, and in the quiet space of that genuine exchange, in a candlelit restaurant, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday evening, something shifted between them that neither of them would have been able to articulate in the moment, but that both of them could feel with the wordless accuracy of people who had spent too many years in rooms where that particular kind of feeling was entirely absent. When Evelyn finally leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table in a posture that her publicist would have found alarming, and said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to hear it before you react." Marcus was prepared for almost anything. Almost. He was not prepared for her to ask if he had ever considered, even hypothetically, the idea of letting a complete stranger temporarily reorganize the trajectory of his life. He stared at her. He said very carefully that he was going to need her to explain what that meant. She explained. She had a series of high-profile public events over the following 6 weeks: a charity gala, a foundation dinner, a board anniversary celebration, at each of which she was expected to appear with the invisible partner that the public had been speculating about for 3 years. She was tired of fielding those speculations alone. She was proposing that Marcus accompany her. As her guest, nothing contractual, nothing transactional in the way he was probably imagining, simply 2 adults who had just had a genuinely good dinner, agreeing to continue the experiment in a slightly more formal context. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He told her no. He told her that whatever she needed him to be for a series of public appearances, he was not it, and that he had spent enough of the evening in proximity to people who saw him as something useful rather than someone real. He told her politely and without anger, and he reached for his jacket. Evelyn laughed. It was an unexpected sound, not the composed, measured laugh she deployed in professional settings, but something more genuine and less controlled, a laugh of the kind that arrives when something has surprised a person into it. She told him she appreciated the answer. She told him, in fact, that his answer was why she had asked, and that most men she encountered did not say no to her for any reason, and that the ones who did were generally lying. Marcus paused in the act of putting on his jacket. He told her that was a strange way of making a proposal more appealing. She agreed. She told him she had something even more unusual to suggest, and that he should sit back down for it. He sat back down. Over the following weeks, Marcus would occasionally review the chain of events that had led from that Tuesday table to everything that came after, and he would identify this as the moment, the second sitting down, the returning of the jacket to the back of the chair, as the precise hinge on which the whole thing had turned. Evelyn did not propose the arrangement again. Instead, she told him her actual story, the version she kept off record, the one that began in a two-bedroom apartment in East Baltimore with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a library card that Marcus would later say was probably worth more than any business school in the country. She had been driven by something that she now recognized as not entirely healthy, not the clean ambition of a person who loves what they build, but the harder, more complicated hunger of a person who is trying to become, through achievement, safe. Every company she built was a layer of insulation. Every deal she closed was evidence she collected against the possibility of being unable to take care of herself. And then Richard had arrived, and she had believed, for the first time in many years, that she was allowed to need something beyond the protection of her own success. And then Richard had taken that belief and filed it in a folder with his other strategic assets, and Evelyn had rebuilt the insulation thicker, higher, harder, until she was $3 billion into a life that was entirely hers and almost entirely empty. Marcus told her about the marriage that hadn't been. 7 years with a woman named Diane, who had been his whole world, and who had left, ultimately, not for another person, but for a version of life that Marcus's particular kind of steady, grounded loyalty could not provide. He did not tell this story with bitterness. He told it with the careful honesty of someone who has done the work of understanding his own part in an outcome, and Evelyn recognized in his telling a quality she had rarely encountered: the willingness to hold complexity without resolving it falsely in one's own favor. They talked until the restaurant staff began to move with the deliberate slowness of people who are too professional to ask a table to leave but hope very much that they will. Evelyn paid the bill. Marcus let her, only after a brief and genuine negotiation that she won, on the specific grounds that she had invited herself to his table without asking. They walked out into the Atlanta night, and the air was warm, and the city was going about its business. And Marcus shook her hand at the curb and said he hoped she found what she was looking for. She told him she rather thought she might. The article appeared 9 days later. A photograph taken by someone with a phone on the sidewalk outside Harrington's. Slightly blurry but recognizable enough: Evelyn Carter in conversation with a man who was quickly identified. The headline offered the information with maximum implication and minimum fact. Billionaire Evelyn Carter's mystery man revealed. The internet accepted the invitation with enthusiasm. Within 24 hours, Marcus Johnson of Atlanta, Georgia, had been profiled on 6 separate platforms. His landscaping company's website had crashed twice from traffic, and the spaces of every major entertainment publication contained a debate about his intentions that ranged from charitable speculation to conclusions so uncharitable that Marcus read them for approximately 8 minutes before deciding, firmly and permanently, that he would not do that again. What struck him most was not the cruelty of it. Cruelty was at least honest about what it was, but the absolute confidence with which complete strangers constructed elaborate theories about a man they had never met, drawing conclusions about his character and his motives from a single sidewalk photograph taken from 20 yards away. People who had never exchanged a word with him had already determined who he was, what he wanted, and what he deserved, and they stated these determinations with the authority of eyewitnesses. He found this more disorienting than hurtful, and he found it hurtful enough. His phone rang constantly. Several of his commercial clients called with questions that were ostensibly about contract renewals but were transparently about the photographs. His foreman, a quiet and practical man named Gerald, who had worked with Marcus for 9 years and had never once expressed interest in his personal life, appeared in the office doorway one morning and said, with characteristic economy, that the crew had seen the news and wanted Marcus to know that it didn't change anything about how they saw him. Marcus thanked him. It was the most genuinely helpful thing anyone said to him that entire week. His mother called 3 times. Darnell called 11. A producer from a morning television program called, asking for an exclusive interview. Marcus turned his phone face down on his kitchen table and went to work. Evelyn's response was immediate and public. She issued a statement through her communications director that was direct enough to be unusual for a statement of its type, affirming that Marcus Johnson was someone she respected and knew personally, and that speculation about his motives was both unfounded and frankly embarrassing to the people participating in it. She made 2 additional remarks on the record that her publicist privately described as nuclear for a standard crisis protocol, but did not attempt to retract because Evelyn did not retract things. The statement reduced the noise briefly before amplifying it significantly. Marcus was moved by it. He was also troubled by it, in the particular way that a man with significant personal pride is troubled by the experience of being defended, because being defended implies that an attack has landed and that someone else has decided you cannot handle it alone. He called Evelyn to thank her and to tell her he preferred to handle his own affairs. She told him she was aware of that, and that she had made the statement for herself as much as for him, because she was tired of watching people she cared about be diminished without consequence. There was a brief silence. Marcus asked when she had decided she cared about him. She told him she was still working on an answer to that question and would let him know. The interview was arranged. A daytime program, a format Marcus distrusted but agreed to for reasons he would later have difficulty articulating, precisely perhaps because the alternative, which was continued silence, while the narrative about him metastasized in public, felt worse. He was composed on camera, measured and specific in a way that read as confident without being defensive. He talked about his business. He talked about integrity. He did not talk about Evelyn, except to say that she was someone he had met under circumstances he found difficult to describe and found considerably easier to appreciate. The segment was well received. Several observers noted, with what appeared to be genuine surprise, that he seemed to be a person of substance. Marcus found this observation more depressing than encouraging and did not say so publicly. And then Thomas Wexler arrived. Thomas Wexler was 46, handsome in the particular way of men who have always been handsome and have organized a significant portion of their identity around that fact. And he had been Evelyn's fiancé for 14 months before she discovered the details of his business arrangements with her company's information. He had spent the 3 years since that discovery in a sustained effort at rehabilitation that combined genuine personal development with strategic positioning. He had attended therapy, he said, and done the work, he said, and arrived at an understanding of his failures that he was prepared to demonstrate through action rather than just words. He appeared at an event where Evelyn was scheduled to speak, approached her in the 15-minute window between her arrival and the formal proceedings, and said what he had prepared to say. He was, by all accounts, convincing. The press, which had been tracking his movements in Evelyn's direction for some time, received his reappearance with the enthusiasm of a storyline that writes itself. Billionaire's former fiancé makes play for reconciliation. The photographs of his approach were on every major entertainment platform within the hour. Marcus read about it the following morning. He read it twice. He sat with his coffee and the early morning quiet of his Atlanta kitchen and thought about it with the methodical care he brought to most problems that required thinking, which was to say that he approached it from the outside, turned it over, examined its weight and shape, and tried to determine what it actually demanded from him. What it demanded, he concluded, was nothing. Thomas Wexler's return was Evelyn's story to navigate, not his. He and Evelyn had been what, exactly? Friends with a charged undercurrent that neither of them had named yet. He was not her partner. He was not her protector. The last thing she needed, he told himself, was another man positioning himself around her life like a fixture she had not requested. He texted her a single message. Whatever you decide about that situation, I support you." And then he went to work, which is where Marcus Johnson went when the world became too much for standing still. Evelyn did not respond to Thomas Wexler's overture in the way that Thomas Wexler had planned for, or indeed in any way that could be reasonably characterized as positive. She listened to what he said, with the steady, unreadable attention she brought to business negotiations, that she had already decided against. And when he finished, she told him that she wished him well and meant it entirely, and that she had no interest in returning to a story she had already concluded. Thomas had expected this as a first position. He adjusted his approach. Evelyn moved on to the next conversation. What remained with her, in the days that followed, was not a rekindled consideration of Thomas Wexler, but a clearer understanding of what she felt about Marcus Johnson clarified, as such things sometimes are, by the contrast. Thomas's return had the texture of something calculated, even now, even with the therapy and the work. Marcus's text, simple, brief, and asking nothing, had the texture of something else entirely. She found herself rereading it more than she intended to. She noticed, too, with a sharpness that surprised her, that Marcus had not fought for her. He had not staked a claim, or made a scene, or positioned himself heroically against the competition in the way that men in his situation, she knew from experience, generally did when they felt something slipping. He had stepped back, politely, deliberately, without drama, because he respected her autonomy more than he wanted to win. She had known this about him, abstractly. Since the first night, it was part of what had drawn her to his table in the first place, the quality of a man who carries himself with dignity rather than strategy. But understanding it abstractly and encountering it in action were different things, and the second was considerably more affecting than the first. He grew quieter after that. His assistant told her, when Evelyn called the landscaping company office on a practical pretext, that Marcus was on site and unreachable most of the day. His phone went to voicemail more often than it didn't. He was not cruel or cold. In any of his brief replies, he was just withdrawn, in the way of someone who has decided, privately and without announcement, that the geography of a situation has changed and that the appropriate response is to relocate. Evelyn had spent 41 years being the one who pulled back. She had the muscles for it, well-developed and reliable. She did not have the muscles for the other side, and discovering their absence was an education she found thoroughly uncomfortable. The experience of being the person who reached and was not met, who sent the message that went unreturned for a longer than comfortable amount of time, who found herself checking her phone with an attention she normally reserved for acquisition deadlines, was an education she had not expected and could not have prepared for. It was humbling in the specific way that experiences are humbling when they require you to discover, at 41, that there are categories of vulnerability you have successfully avoided your entire life, and that avoidance, it turns out, was not the same thing as immunity. She had built walls. She had maintained them with the diligence and skill of someone who understood that the alternative was exposure, and that exposure had consequences. She had not, until now, fully understood that the walls that kept the bad things out were also keeping out the precise things she was currently missing. She thought about calling him directly and simply saying the things she meant. This was the kind of action that she took without hesitation in business, in negotiations, in rooms full of men who expected her to be indirect or deferential or patient in ways that did not serve her interests. But this was different in a way that she could not entirely account for with her usual analytical tools, and the difference made her careful in a way that she recognized was unfamiliar, and that she could not decide whether to honor or override. She did not call. She thought about it more. She thought about it on a Sunday morning in the penthouse apartment that the architectural magazine had photographed in flattering light, drinking coffee in the kitchen while the Atlanta skyline went about its morning business outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. And the silence of the apartment was the particular silence of a space that is objectively beautiful and contains, at that moment, only one person who is aware of the lack. She had built everything she owned. She had built it from nothing, from a library card and an instinct and a willingness to work with a consistency that people who had not done it could not easily imagine. And she had arrived here, in this extraordinary space, at 41 years old, and the thing she wanted most was also the thing she had spent the longest amount of time learning to live without. She made a decision. It took her approximately 45 minutes to make it, and approximately 45 seconds to act on it once she had, which was typical of her decision-making process in both life and business. She told her assistant to clear 2 days. She told her security team that she would be traveling without them, which produced a reaction she dealt with firmly and briefly. She packed one bag. She drove herself in the kind of car that is chosen for its anonymity rather than its performance, to the neighborhood where Marcus Johnson worked and lived, and she spent the better part of those 2 days finding out who he was to the people who knew him best. She walked into the community center 2 blocks from his office, where he had, it turned out, been volunteering every other Saturday for 4 years, helping the after-school program with basic business education for teenagers who were trying to understand how money worked. She sat at the back and watched him explain profit margins to a group of 15-year-olds using the example of his own company, speaking about the early years with a frankness about failure and financial stress that made the teenagers laugh and lean forward at the same time. She talked to his employee, a young woman named Keisha, who had been with him for 6 years, who told her without prompting that Marcus was the kind of employer who had once driven 40 minutes in a rainstorm to cover a site himself rather than ask an employee to work in unsafe conditions, and who had given her a week of paid leave when her mother was hospitalized and told her the work would be there when she came back. She walked past his house. It was modest by the standards of his income and immaculate in the way of a person who takes care of things. There were potted plants on the front porch that were clearly well maintained, and a basketball hoop in the driveway that had been used recently, and a welcome mat with paint on it that might have been a child's art project. She stood on the sidewalk in front of it for a moment, in her unremarkable rental car clothes, and felt something that she had not felt in a long and specific number of years, the particular, irreducible certainty of knowing exactly what she wanted. She knocked on his door on a Thursday evening, when the light was going golden, and the neighborhood was settling into the comfortable noise of people coming home. She heard him inside a pause, footsteps, the specific quality of someone who checks a window before opening a door, which was a habit she recognized because she had it too. The door opened. Marcus looked at her across the threshold, with an expression that moved through surprise and uncertainty, and something that might have been relief. In that order, and very quickly, he said her name. She said his. She told him she had been in his neighborhood for 2 days, and that she had not told him because she had needed to understand something before she said it out loud, and that she had understood it now. He asked her what she had understood. She told him she had understood that he was exactly who she had believed him to be on the first night, and that the world had very few of those very few people who are simply, consistently, genuinely themselves, without performance or calculation, and that she had spent a long time allowing fear to disguise itself as wisdom and talk her out of believing in things she could plainly see. She told him she was tired of the disguise. She told him she was sorry for the distance she had allowed to grow between them, and that she was aware the apology was overdue, and that she had a question she needed to ask him before she spent another day not asking it. Marcus looked at her. The evening light was warm on the porch. The neighborhood was going about the ordinary, irreplaceable business of a Thursday. He asked her what the question was. Evelyn reached into the pocket of her jacket. She had, she explained, gone back and forth on this particular gesture, on whether it was too much, too fast, too theatrical, on whether it flattened into performance, something that she needed to mean as its plain self. She had decided that the risk of being misread was less important than the clarity of being understood. She brought out a ring. It was not enormous. It was beautiful, in the careful way of a thing chosen with attention rather than spectacle. A ring chosen by a person who knows what she is choosing and has thought about it with the full weight of who she is. She looked at Marcus, who was very still on the other side of the threshold, and she said, "Marry me, Marcus." The evening seemed to pause around the sentence. The light held. The neighborhood sounds continued their distant, ordinary course, indifferent to the specific gravity of the moment on this particular porch. Marcus looked at the ring. He looked at her face, which was stripped of its usual professional composure in a way he had seen before, that night at Harrington's, when she was being honest about something that cost her, and the nakedness of her expression made something shift in his chest, with the force of a thing that has been waiting for permission. He thought about the Tuesday night that had seemed at the time like the final evidence in a case against hope. He thought about the way she had crossed a restaurant to tell a stranger that his dignity was worth acknowledging. He thought about all the ways that people can spend their time, the countless evenings lost to calculation and performance, and the management of risk, and how rarely, in a life, you are offered a moment that is simply and purely what it appears to be. He had been afraid of the distance between their worlds, afraid that the gap in wealth and public life, and the sheer volume of difference between the life he lived and the life she lived, would be, ultimately, unbridgeable. It was a reasonable fear. It was the kind of fear that reasonable, self-respecting men carry when they enter situations that seem to overflow their ordinary boundaries. But standing in his doorway looking at Evelyn Carter, who had come without security or press, or any of the apparatus of her public life, who had spent 2 days in his neighborhood learning who he was, because she needed to know before she could say what she felt. Marcus understood something that reason alone had not been sufficient to convey, that the distance between them was real and would require real navigation, and that she was offering to navigate it with him, and that a person did not do what she had done in the past 2 days, unless the love behind it was the kind that holds. He stepped forward. He took the ring from her hand and held it for a moment, and Evelyn's breath did a thing she would not have permitted in any other company. And then Marcus said, quietly and without performance, that yes, he would marry her. The sound that came from Evelyn Carter at that moment was not the composed, measured sound of a woman accustomed to winning negotiations. It was the sound of relief and joy arriving together at the end of a long road, of a person who has been trying for a long time to protect herself from wanting something, and has finally, gratefully, stopped trying. Marcus put the ring on her finger. Then he pulled her into an embrace on the front porch of his modest, immaculate house, in the golden Thursday evening light, while the neighborhood went about its ordinary, irreplaceable business all around them, and he held her the way that people hold things they intend to keep. The news broke the following morning, as it was always going to. A neighbor's ring doorbell, a photograph with geolocation, the internet's insatiable appetite for a story that contained billionaires and romance, and the satisfying narrative shape of an unlikely match. The response was thunderous and contradictory, and largely irrelevant. Some people were moved by it, some people were suspicious of it, and a great many people totted bit. This was a choice they had discussed, briefly and practically. In the first 24 hours, a mutual decision to allow the noise its natural life cycle without participating in it, to tend to the actual relationship rather than its public reflection. Evelyn's communications team prepared statements. Marcus's business phone rang with the expected volume of journalistic inquiry. Both of them went about their lives with the equanimity of people who have decided that what they are building matters more than what other people think of it. The wedding was held 6 months later. It was not small exactly, but it was private 53 people, all of whom could be described without exaggeration as genuinely necessary. Mrs. Abrams, who had hired Marcus to rake her leaves 11 years earlier, and had, in the intervening years, become something between a mentor and a cherished fixture of his life, wore a yellow dress and cried from the first note of the opening music and did not apologize for it. Darnell, who spent the entire reception in a state of comprehensive emotional overwhelm that he described, when asked, as happiness, but that manifested primarily as crying, and the repeated phrase, I told you, directed at Marcus, with the vindicated triumph of a man who had spent 18 months pushing his friend toward a dating application and considered the outcome a personal achievement. Marcus's mother, who told Evelyn over the canapés, and with absolute directness, that she had been watching her son not find the right person for a very long time, and that she was holding her personally accountable for the continuation of his happiness, which Evelyn received with the seriousness it deserved and the gratitude it warranted, and then embraced her with a warmth that made Evelyn go still for a brief moment, before leaning into it in the way of a person accepting something they have been waiting for without knowing the exact shape of it. Keisha, and 3 other employees who had driven 4 hours and arrived in their best clothes with handwritten cards, each of which Marcus kept. 2 of Evelyn's oldest friends from Baltimore women, who had known her before the first company and the first acquisition and the magazine covers, who had watched her build and succeed and close herself off, and now watched her stand in a garden in late afternoon light and let someone in. The ceremony was outdoors. The flowers were simple. Nobody had a publicist present. Marcus stood at the front of the assembled people and watched Evelyn walk toward him. No elaborate procession, no theatrical production, just a woman in a dress she had chosen because she liked it, walking toward a man she had chosen because she knew him. And the full weight of the chain of events that had led to this particular moment passed through him with the quality of something that resists being summarized. A bad date on a Tuesday. A woman who crossed a room to acknowledge a stranger's dignity. 2.5 hours of genuine conversation that had gone on longer than the restaurant wanted it to. A media storm he had not invited and had managed with more grace than he had known, at the start of it, that he possessed. A quiet text sent from a kitchen table when all the calculated responses would have been more dramatic. 2 days of a billionaire walking his streets without a press team, learning who he was, from the people who worked alongside him and beside him and because of him. A ring produced on a porch in golden light by a woman who had spent 20 years building walls and had finally, with the full force of her considerable intelligence and will, decided that the walls were costing her more than the exposure ever would. He had spent a long time trying to understand how the worst evening of his recent life had become the corridor through which the best part of it arrived. He had stopped trying to understand it and had decided, instead, simply to be grateful. Grateful for the humiliation he had endured with dignity, because the dignity had been seen. Grateful for the fear he had carried about the gap between their worlds, because carrying it honestly had been more useful than pretending it didn't exist. Grateful, most of all, for the particular and irreplaceable quality of a person who, when she chose you entirely and with open eyes. There is a particular truth that is difficult to state plainly, without sounding like something printed on a motivational poster, which is that the moments in a life that look, from the inside, like failures are sometimes something else entirely. Sometimes they are corridors. Sometimes they are the necessary dark before something finds you. Sometimes the evening you are most certain represents a final and definitive verdict about your worth is actually an evening that is taking you somewhere you could not have navigated toward directly, through a door you did not know existed and would not have thought to look for on your own. Marcus Johnson had sat alone at a table in Harrington's restaurant and absorbed the quiet humiliation of being found insufficient. And in the space of that absorption, in the stillness he had chosen over drama, he had been seen by someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. And Evelyn Carter had crossed a restaurant on a Tuesday night because something in the quality of one man's dignity had reminded her that the walls she had built, however necessary they had once seemed, were not the same thing as safety, and that the life she had spent 20 years constructing with brilliant, disciplined precision had been missing, the whole time, the one thing that no acquisition strategy and no board approval and no amount of square footage in a penthouse apartment could supply. They had found each other in the aftermath of small disasters. They had found each other in a restaurant on a night when neither of them was looking for what they found. They had found each other in the way that the best things generally arrive, not when everything is arranged and optimal and the conditions are exactly right, but at the moment when the performance of control breaks down and the actual person is briefly, vulnerably available to be known. Marcus had been known. Evelyn had been known. The rings on their hands, at the end of that outdoor ceremony in the evening light, were not symbols of a fairy tale. They were symbols of two people who had decided clearly and without illusion to choose each other, knowing exactly who each of them was. That, in the end, is what makes a marriage real and lasting and worth the difficulty of getting to it. Not the circumstances of meeting or the implausibility of the match on paper, and not the noise of a world that will always have a great deal to say about what two people choose to build together in private. Not the billboards and the business strategy and the careful management of public perception. Only the choosing. Only the honest, clear-eyed, fully informed willingness to look at another person with their history and their wounds and their particular way of carrying themselves through the world and say, yes, you, exactly as you are. That is the one I choose. Marcus Johnson had gone to Harrington's on a Tuesday night expecting almost nothing and had come away with something he hadn't known he was missing. Evelyn Carter had come for the salmon and the quiet and had found, at a corner table, the reason to believe that her walls had been keeping out the wrong things. They had taken the long road through embarrassment and public scrutiny, and the careful, difficult work of two private people learning to be seen, and the long road had delivered them somewhere real, somewhere neither of them could have arrived at directly. The kind of somewhere that requires, as its prerequisite, a willingness to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, to stay at the table when leaving would be easier, and to let the story continue past the point where it appears to have ended. Evelyn had asked first, and Marcus had, after a long moment on a golden porch, said yes. And what began on the worst night of a decent man's recent life became the beginning of the best years of two people who had each, in their own way, been waiting longer than they knew for a story that finally felt like theirs. That is enough. That, in the end, is everything. They were simply there, in the place they had chosen, with the people who mattered, having finally arrived by the longest and most improbable of routes at the ordinary, extraordinary thing they had both been looking for all along.